Euthanasia, commonly known as assisted suicide, is a heated subject with people not always knowing where they really stand. This issue is complicated from a religious, moral, and medical standpoint. It has been a controversial topic for centuries going back to ancient Greece and Rome. The topic of assisted suicide was brought back up after the development of ether. Most physicians started to think that the use of anesthetics will help relieve the pains of their patients in general, but also how it could help in their patients' deaths. In 1870, Samuel Williams first proposed the idea of using morphine and anesthetics to intentionally end a patient's life. This idea caused quite an uproar. For the next 35 years, the debates over the use of anesthetics to purposely end a patient's life began. The debates mostly involved the morality and ethics of using the drug to end someone's life. These debates raged primarily in the United States and Britain. As a result of it being such a huge topic, on January 23, 1906, Ohio proposed a bill to legalize euthanasia. In the same year, Dr. R.H. Gregory introduced a similar bill to the state of Iowa. Both of these bills were defeated and received the name the chloroform bills. They received this name because of the drug they wanted to use in the bill. They wanted to use chloroform. In the year of 1911, a woman named Sadie Merchant was struggling to breathe, as she only had one functioning lung. It is rumored that she lost her other lung due to her bronchitis. She was struggling to breathe for years until she had enough and asked for help with dying. She was living with the Shaker colony, and as a result, Brother Gia and Sister Sears started praying and asking God for help. They decided that it was the right thing to do, so they helped Sister Sadie in her request in dying. Brother Gia and Sister Sears of the Shaker colony were then arrested for willful murder from the use of chloroform to end Sister Sadie's life. But their case was dismissed in January 1912 because the grand jury refused to indict either of them. Sadie's case was spread all across the country as it was written about in newspapers like the Washington Times and the New York Times. Sadie's death and the Shakers' case being dismissed made the idea of euthanasia more concrete and real in people's minds, making people see and believe it was merciful in the cases of terminal and chronic illness. In 1935, an organization for the legalization of assisted suicide began in England. It was called the Voluntary Euthanasia Legalization Society. It was founded by C. Killick Miller. He later wrote to Britain's medical journal stating that he did not want the British Medical Association to share their opinion on the matter. He wrote to them not to share an opinion because of the way this responded to the first time a bill was introduced on the euthanasia topic, and seeing how they attacked Dr. R.H. Gregory on the Iowa bill, he did not wish for them to write about his organization. He continued to write, saying that the decision to die was not a medical one. In 1936, a bill was introduced into the House of Lords in Britain that stated that anyone over the age of 21 and were mentally capable would be able to request a euthanasia shot, but they had to be fatally ill, have enough immense pain to warrant death, and or have an incurable disease. This bill also included that the patient had to be seen and diagnosed by several doctors as well as registered to the Minister of Health. At that point, the Minister of Health would interview the dying person. After all those steps, the person will then have the right to receive or deny the euthanasia shot. But this bill was ultimately passed. This bill is very similar to the bill that we have in law today called the Patient Access to End of Life Care Act in parts of the United States. However, 21 years later, the Vatican weighed in stating that the passive assisted suicide was acceptable in order to get the narrative changed after the Pope's opinion on assisted suicide was shared. Passive euthanasia is the act of letting a patient's life-saving medicine go, for example, a ventilator. This gave way to opening the discussion for legalization of assisted suicide. 4 decades after the statement, Oregon legalized assisted suicide, being the first U.S. state to do so, but there were countermeasures against this law, making it an uphill battle for the next 3 years. People started protesting this act, whether they were with the act or not, including the lower court. The lower court was not with the act of approving the law, and they tried to administer a federal anti-drug law to prohibit doctors from aiding and helping terminally ill patients with ending their lives. The case ended up going to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for reviewing, and they ultimately decided to dismiss all the protests and the lower court's ruling going against Oregon's Death with Dignity Act. And with that, Oregon's euthanasia bill was put into effect in 1997. Around the same time the law was put into effect, Dr. Jack Kevorkian, also known as Dr. Death, went around the United States helping 130 people go through with assisted suicide with his death machine. The death machine is a box that had a switch where the patient would press it, and the IV that was connected to the box would then release a medicine that would end the patient's life. Dr. Kevorkian called it Thanatron. After the first 2 deaths he performed or assisted with, Dr. Kevorkian's medical license was revoked. This made it harder for him to gather the medications for his death machine, so he had to be creative, and he eventually made another machine called Mercitron, also known as the Mercy Machine. The Mercitron used carbon monoxide to end a patient's life. On March 26, 1997, district attorneys brought charges against Jack Kevorkian, but he was only charged once with the case of Thomas Yoke. a 52-year-old man. The evidence that they had with this case was that Dr. Kevorkian had recorded the death on September 17, 1998, and sent it to be aired on the show 60 Minutes on November 23, 1998. Further evidence showed that Thomas had a late stage of ASL and he was not able to give himself the medication. Dr. Kevorkian gave him the shot. After they showed the recording of Dr. Kevorkian giving Thomas the life-ending medication, he was then interviewed by the host, Mike Wallace.
Have him suffer in that kind of frame of mind, because if the man is terrified, it's up to me to dispel that terror.
In March 1999, Dr. Kevorkian was charged with the death of Thomas due to the fact that there was evidence proving that he was guilty and that he was representing himself. It would make it easier to convict Dr. Kevorkian, for he was not familiar with the law, therefore he would have a difficult time defending against the charges. Dr. Kevorkian also had fun with the trials by giving stunts like showing up in a powdered wig and signs. In the end, Dr. Death was convicted with second-degree homicide. He was sentenced for 10 to 25 years. Dr. Kevorkian was paroled early in December 2006 due to his own terminal illness, and he was fully released in June 2007, after promising he would never aid in someone's death. He succumbed to death in 2011. He is famous for his saying, "Dying is not a crime." Religion is brought up heavily in the argument against euthanasia dating back to the ancient Greece. In ancient Greece, they believed that any form of suicide goes against what the gods intend for their subjects concerning life itself. They believed that life was precious and that it was not for them to decide when they should part with it. They believed that it was for the gods to decide. So with that, the matter of euthanasia was very controversial, and it was heavily frowned upon during both the classical and Hellenistic periods. After those periods came to an end, the narrative of suicide was changed. As the years passed in Greece, suicide was more open as some philosophers started thinking about it and changing their minds, saying that it was more honorable to die in the way they choose. So by the start of the 1st century, it was prized to die in a way that was deemed honorable, with many thinking that it was better than to be humiliated on the way out. In ancient Rome, on the other hand, they did not really put that much thought into suicide. They also found it more honorable to die in a way that they seemed fit. The philosopher Lucius Annaeus Seneca also stated in agreement by saying, "Life itself is slavery when one lacks the courage to die." With that, more people started saying it more cowardly to not be able to die when needed be. What is interesting is that they even have some sort of law in place regarding suicide, just like how we have a law in place today. According to the 1st century Latin writer Valerius Maximus in the Greek colony Massalia, present-day Marseille, he would write about how citizens were able to request permission to commit suicide. If the citizen had an acceptable reason for the death, they would receive a poison made from hemlock, without any charge. However, if the reason was deemed unfit, they would get some sort of help in regard to the suicidal thoughts, sort of like therapy. Moving on, religion in the future relates more to the way how the Greeks viewed suicide in the beginning, which is why it was such a big deal as the years went by and religion started gaining more followers. In the Catholic religion, it is not okay to commit suicide, and it is viewed as throwing the life that God gave you right back into his face. As a Catholic myself, I have been taught to never put anything above my love for God, not even my own family. So the thought of euthanasia seems very interesting to me, as I would never even think of dying in a different way, or other than the way God seems fit. It is also interesting to see how the Bible represents suicide. In the Bible, suicide was written as a mortal sin that destroyed the relationship that one had with God himself, though it was removed from being a mortal sin in 1983. Christians still view it as a major sin against God, saying that it is God's power to give and take life, so taking your own life makes it seem like you do not value God's judgment. Some Catholics believe that if you do not bear with the sufferings and or lessons that the Lord gives you, you are not ready to walk hand in hand with the Lord into heaven. All in all, the arguments on euthanasia as a whole are very complex, showing the importance of regulations that need to be followed and the historical presence that it has on the whole country. With it being so controversial, it makes it a reminder on why we have responsibility to live up to and the rights that we have, such as the right to end our own life.